So I'd like to introduce Ed Graham on the far left over there. Ed is a PhD candidate here at SFU. His research interests include critical theory, cultural studies, and contemporary literature and film. And I'm also very pleased to say that I'm on his committee. His senior supervisor's over there, Clint Burnham. Take it away, Ed.
Okay, thanks, Samir. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to be looking at the importance of the figure of intoxication as it appears in Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, and also for Adorno's understanding of critique and rationality more broadly. So to bring out the significance of this idea of intoxication, I compare alongside Walter Benjamin, a thinker for whom intoxication was kind of more explicitly central, and I try to sort of draw out some differences and similarities between him and Adorno. Adorno's perspective on intoxication is related to his criticism of philosophers who affirm existence without thoroughly understanding the ways in which such affirmations are mediated by the social process. So taking aim at kind of philosophers that don't recognize the way in which the social process, like capitalism, structures their own ideas. I think Steph kind of brought this out really well in her presentation. And this is also in like Gillian Rose's book, where she talks about Adorno's critiques of Heidegger and Nietzsche. Intoxication and affirmation come together as an object of critique in Adorno's correspondence with Walter Benjamin between 1935 and 1938. So for Walter Benjamin, modernity is constituted by a series of intoxicating phantasmagoria, a host of reifying representations embodied in new technologies, architecture, and mass culture that emerge in the 19th century, and which form the basis of his uncompleted study of the Parisian arcades. So on one level, there are certainly parallels between Benjamin and Adorno in how they treat the intrusion of the commodity into everyday life as intoxicating, in how they view capitalism as a kind of collective intoxication that infects everything with sameness. However, there are key differences that at first glance position Adorno more kind of on the side of rationality compared with Benjamin. So for Benjamin, a way into decoding the labyrinth of capitalist modernity is through a different kind of intoxication. And this can be seen in his kind of like famous experiments where he smokes hashish and then starts writing a bunch of stuff about those experiences. So against the historical hallucination of sameness, which takes root along with the commodity economy, Benjamin used his hashish experiments to rethink the category of sameness in a new way, to cut through to the genuine aura that appears in all things. Yet it is a sameness defined not in terms of perfect resemblance between one thing and another, but with the possibility that a single thing could be in different places at the same time. So this attention to different states of consciousness influences Benjamin's adoption of a more childlike and ultimately utopian perspective on history. So I have a couple of quotes here. So the first one is from Dusan Bielic's book about sort of like intoxication and modernity in Freud and Benjamin. And so he talks about how for Benjamin, hashish, it kind of like awakens his mimetic faculties that have been lost through modernity. So it's kind of like a way of reawakening that. However, the insights afforded by this sort of counter intoxication don't amount to just like a promotion of drug use, but the important thing is what Benjamin terms profane illumination. So this is a kind of critical theoretical tool to which drugs such as hash provide a kind of introductory lesson that allows us to see through capitalist social relations and bring about solidarity and resistance. So this is kind of embodied in this second quote where Benjamin, he writes this letter to Max Horkheimer and talks about how critical theory needs to kind of like, not just use like reason, but also kind of like like recognize the powers of intoxication for critical theory, to bring, to overcome kind of individuality and kind of bring about more collective resistance. For Adorno, however, Benjamin's attitude affirms too much. Adorno doesn't discuss Benjamin's hashish protocols directly, but his criticisms in his letters to Benjamin, which take issue with the latter's insufficiently dialectical descriptions of phantasmagoria and the commodity and appeals to a collective consciousness, reflects a broader warning at affirming revolutionary intoxications existing in the here and now. So in Adorno's comments on Benjamin's draft to the Arcades project, he says, "The interior should be made transparent as a social function, and its self-containedness should be revealed as an illusion, not vis-a-vis a hypostasized collective consciousness, but vis-a-vis the real social process itself." So again, this is kind of bringing back to the idea of like taking into account the social process as forming like the individual subject. So in other words, rather than counterposing the intoxications of modernity with a different kind of intoxication, as in Benjamin, Adorno wants something more kind of critical and systematic. So he criticizes Benjamin for invoking archaic images that come through his hashish experiences, when these are precisely products of capitalism which demand further interrogation. For Adorno, Benjamin's one-dimensional critique of the bourgeois interior, as in this quotation, Adorno argues that Benjamin ironically subjectivizes the intoxications of modernity and suggests in his letters that Benjamin consider historicizing the commodity form more thoroughly. So I'm going to shift gears now to talk a bit about the dialectic of Enlightenment, where some ideas around some kind of themes of intoxication also appear. So Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis of the Sirens episode in the Odyssey dramatizes the birth of subjectivity in reason's battle with the allure of intoxication. Odysseus' twofold solution devised to avoid the luring call of the siren song works as allegory on a number of levels, representing the birth of self-preservation and modern subjectivity, the accompanying suppression of both inner and external nature, the complicity of culture in all this, and the class division of bourgeoisie and proletariat. So on the one hand, Odysseus orders his crew to plug their ears and focus on the labor of rowing past the sirens. Reflecting the modern workforce, they, quote, must look ahead with alert concentration and ignore anything which lies to one side, and are therefore made practical. Odysseus himself, on the other hand, can hear the beautiful song, yet is shackled to the mast while his crew row. Odysseus represents the bourgeois figure that senses happiness and freedom, yet, given his dependence on the toil of the working class, can never truly experience it. Later, beauty becomes fixed in art as an object of consumption for the bourgeoisie, but just as for Benjamin, there is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of there is no document of culture which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. For Horkheimer and Adorno, culture is dialectically imbricated in the domination of nature. So in other words, the threat of intoxication is something that must be fixed and tamed by Enlightenment and its institutions. Okay, so the exact relationship between intoxication and nature and beauty lies outside the scope of this paper, but we can pay attention to how intoxication, as embodied in Adorno and Horkheimer's account of the Siren Song, feeds into Adorno's broader conception of critique kind of more broadly. So the beautiful song of the sirens is described as overpowering and inescapable, at once a challenge to the patriarchal order and a regressive step back into the past, where, quote, the promise of a happy homecoming is the deception by which the past entraps a humanity filled with longing, end quote. It represents that which had to have the most identical, purpose-directed masculine injuries inflicted on it for the self to survive itself. For Adorno and Horkheimer, the allure of the sirens represents a tension that has always haunted civilization. On the one hand, the need to preserve one's ego, and on the other, the temptation to be rid of it. Crucially, it is through this constant allure of intoxication that actually allows the ego to continue to preserve itself. So in this quote here, that's where they kind of, they talk about this, this promise of joy, which is akin to narcotic intoxication, which kind of threatens civilization at every moment and allows the kind of dialectic of the individual to sort of keep going. So the march of enlightenment doesn't lead to an elimination of those alluring intoxications like art, drug use, or nature, but instead a continual disciplining of such threats to rationality. And it marks a kind of preservation of the irrational precisely through a kind of war against, like a continual war against it. So we can see that, we can kind of see that Adorno and Horkheimer have a more kind of ambiguous understanding of intoxication compared to Benjamin. So, as hinted at above, for Adorno and Horkheimer, any affirmation of intoxication, of sheer drunken Dionysian excess, is not the revolutionary answer against the iron cage of reason. Such a leap would be ultimately regressive, and it is a leap that Adorno attributes to Benjamin in some respects. So rather, what is needed is a different or better kind of rationality, a furthering of the ideals of enlightenment itself. This can be seen in two quotes. So the first one comes from the Dialectic of Enlightenment, where Adorno and Horkheimer argue that as long as humanity can still critically reflect on its separation from nature, such a remembrance of nature within the subject contains the unrecognized truth of all culture, that enlightenment is opposed in principle to power. So they're kind of drawing attention to the emancipatory potential of enlightenment rather than like kind of fleeing into irrationality. And the second quote comes from Adorno's later negative dialectics. And this, so in this he says the kind of similar, he says that, only by pushing the process of demythologizing or enlightenment to the extreme can like critical theory kind of survive. And this sort of reflects Martin Jay's argument that the Frankfurt School after World War II was marked by the splitting asunder of the union between critical self-reflection and self-realizing action. So for Martin Jay, the possibility of a historical subject capable of ushering in the revolutionary age disappeared, as those like Adorno seemingly chose self-reflection over action. However, I think that what Adorno is interested in here is not greater self-reflection per se, but rather, at least in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the importance of narrative in trying to get us to kind of think alternative life worlds embodied in subjects and spaces not typically represented within like Western discourse. So in my kind of concluding, pretty speculative comments, I want to look at two sets of quotations from Adorno and Benjamin, in which each theorist kind of connects intoxication to ideas around like marginalization, peripheral spaces, and survival. So Adorno already links critical theory with survival in this passage, but he and Horkheimer also connect survival to a kind of utopian evocation of intoxication, which is maybe similar to Benjamin, in their analysis of the story of the Lotus Eaters, where Odysseus basically has to resist this kind of like narcotic lotus food, sort of in a similar manner to the Sirens episode. And so, this is a really, really long passage. They start off saying that they start off pitting intoxication against reason, but then they also link it to like survival, right? So they say that the bliss induced by narcotics, by which subordinate classes have been made capable of enduring the unendurable in ossified social orders. But they then say that they're not, Odysseus is right not to sort of like become intoxicated, essentially. So they then affirm like reason. So they say, Odysseus is therefore right not to endure life among the lotus eaters. Against them he asserts their own cause, the realization of utopia through historical work. But then in the kind of like following passage, it seems like they again kind of, so what I take from this passage is not that Adorno and Horkheimer are saying that Odysseus was ultimately right to suppress the lure of intoxication, but rather I think they're kind of like foregrounding in some kind of way. So one, the sort of link between intoxication and survival within the sort of subordinate classes, and two, through kind of like identification of this like they refer to it as like an Eastern kind of like substance, or like reminiscent of like food, narcotic kind of food in the East. They're kind of like hinting at a utopian sort of space embodied in spaces peripheral to Western civilization. And this is utopian not in the sense of like affirming excess or against reason, or like fetishizing difference, but rather in like remobilizing what Ernst Bloch termed the synchronicity of the non-synchronous. Quote, the effects of older relations and forms of production and older superstructures, that which is far from and alien to the present, includes both declining remnants and, above all, uncompleted past, which has not yet been sublated by capitalism. And so maybe this passage could be accused of like exoticizing the East, but it kind of seems like the image of bliss that they kind of point to here is retained in like dialectical tension with self-preserving reason, right? So they kind of point at the realization of utopia through historical work, and it seems to be like that they're balancing intoxication with reason in some kind of way. And so, again, I'm not really entirely sure where I am with this, but I think there's something similar in, so first of all, in these quotes from Benjamin. So first of all, he ties the use of drug taking to the survival. So he says it's not going too far to say that a principal motive for taking the drug hash is in very many cases to augment the drug taker's resources in the struggle for existence. And then also in this second quote, so this is in Benjamin's little story of where there's a traveler who goes to Marseille and then like smokes hashish and then starts like talking about stuff. But in the sort of build up to that moment, Benjamin kind of like ties intoxication to peripheral enclaves. So he talks about how he makes it his policy to head straight to the suburbs as to learn his way around the outskirts. Never had the first hour been as profitable as the one I spent in and among the inner port and dock installations and warehouses, the poorer neighborhoods, the scattered refuges of the destitute. Outlying districts are, in fact, the town in a state of emergency. They are the terrain upon which the decisive battles between town and country are continuously being fought. And so, the writer Hermann Herlinghaus connects Benjamin's hashish writings to the contemporary context of the war on drugs. And for Herlinghaus, the traveler's immersion into the intoxicated energies of the peripheral zones of Marseille highlights the kind of what he terms the proximity of ecstasy and sobriety, where ecstasy kind of donates the sort of intoxications of consumerism and legal and illicit narcotics characteristic of the global north, while sobriety denotes the grim reality of exploitation and stigmatization of southern spheres. And so this is outside the scope of the paper, but it does kind of give maybe some weight to the argument that Benjamin is more interested in. Well, there's a way into thinking about these more kind of peripheral ideas. So from this short survey, it seems that Adorno's perspective on intoxication isn't so straightforward as a call to sober rationality against the intoxications of contemporary mass culture, the culture industry, and the patterns of fascist propaganda. For one, the intoxicating siren song reminds us of the connection between the emancipatory potential of Enlightenment and nature, pointing at an ecological dimension to Adorno's thought. As well, in their historical context of a need to reformulate Western Marxism in a more totalizing but less orthodox way, in the context of new social movements and the becoming world system of capitalism, with its occupation and colonization of peripheral spaces, both historically and in the present. Both Benjamin and Adorno, I think, stress narratives of intoxication to think through the possibilities of a new kind of revolutionary subject, away from the sort of typical image of the proletariat kind of coming together in the factory. And so this is not a mere affirmation of, but something like an expanded understanding of intoxication and its politics. Thank you.